My mail broke into my house while I was away, fired my babysitter, and smashed my kitchen counters. When I confronted her, she huffed and said, "You should be thanking me." I just stared at her. That was 3 months ago. This morning, she was standing outside my house in tears. My mother-in-law broke into my house, fired my babysitter, and left my home in shambles while fixing it. So I made sure she paid in ways she'll never forget. From the first moment I met her, she made her feelings crystal clear. Daniel, my now husband, brought me over for dinner to meet the family, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Well, you're not what I expected." She didn't say it like she was pleasantly surprised. She said it like she'd just found a hair in her soup. That night, while Daniel was in the bathroom, she leaned in and whispered, "If you're after his money, you won't get a cent while I'm alive." Daniel wasn't rich. We were both fresh out of college, but she said it with the smug confidence of someone who already hated me without reason. It only got worse after that. She's the kind of woman who hides cruelty under the excuse of just being honest. If I got a haircut, she'd say, "It's bold," not in a good way, but bold. If I wore a new dress, she'd wrinkle her nose and mutter, "Some styles just aren't for everyone." She'd forget my birthday, but made sure to buy gifts for Daniel's ex. Yes, the same ex she still invites to family events. Once, at Thanksgiving, she made my favorite pie, then accidentally dropped it on the floor and laughed, saying, "Oops, guess we'll have to eat mine instead." When Daniel and I bought our home, she took it as a personal challenge. She made spare keys without asking. She'd rearrange our furniture while we were at work. She replaced our curtains with ones she liked better. She even went through my pantry and threw out food she decided was too processed, including an unopened box of my favorite chocolates from my late grandmother. When I got pregnant, the nightmare doubled. She announced our pregnancy on Facebook before we had told anyone. She referred to my baby as my child in front of me, and once told a relative, "Hopefully she takes after our side of the family. We don't want her looking like," and then made a vague hand gesture at me. I had to lay down the law. No uninvited visits, no moving in after the baby was born, and no undermining my parenting decisions. She pouted and sulked for weeks. Then came last month. Daniel was away on a 3-day work trip. I planned a quick girls' weekend, leaving our toddler with a trusted babysitter. Everything was fine when I left. When I came home Sunday night, I thought someone had broken in. The smell hit first, a mix of bleach, burnt meat, and some weird floral air freshener that made my eyes water. The furniture was completely rearranged, but not in a thoughtful way. The couch was shoved against a wall, my coffee table was missing, rugs were rolled up in the corner. The hardwood floors had deep gouges, like someone had dragged heavy furniture across them without lifting. The kitchen? Oh god, the kitchen. My marble countertop had a massive crack running through it. One cabinet door was hanging by a single hinge. My fridge was wide open, half the food gone, and there was a charred casserole dish on the stove with something in it that looked like it had died twice. Upstairs was worse. Our bedroom closet had been emptied onto the bed. My makeup was smashed on the floor, jewelry tangled into knots. In the guest room, the babysitter's things were gone. Later, she told me Linda had barged in. Told her, "You're dismissed. This is my son's house. I'll take it from here." Then she physically took her bags to the door and locked it. I called Daniel, no answer. So I called Linda. She answered cheerfully, "Hi, honey. Did you see the house? I fixed it for you." "Fixed it? You trashed it," I said. She huffed. "Your furniture placement was hideous, your babysitter looked incompetent, and that countertop, please. It was already ugly. I deep cleaned your kitchen, made a proper meal for my granddaughter, and got rid of that junk food you insist on feeding her. You should be thanking me." I was shaking. The next morning, I called a contractor. The repairs, floors, countertop, cabinet replacement, and paint touch-ups came to $3,027. I documented everything with photos. When Daniel got back, I showed him. At first, he tried to calm me down. She probably didn't mean it. But when I put the invoice in his hand and said, "She's paying for this," he stopped defending her. We called Linda together. I said, "You owe us $3,027. If I don't get it by the end of the month, I'll file in small claims court." She lost it. "You're unbelievable. After all I've done for you, the cooking, the babysitting, the cleaning, and you're going to treat me like some criminal?" I laughed. "You are a criminal, Linda. You trespassed and vandalized my property." She said, "If you do this to me, I'll tell the family you've been keeping my granddaughter from me." I said, "Go ahead. I'll show them the pictures of the damage and the restraining order I'll file if you ever step foot in my house again." The deadline came. No money. The next morning, I drove straight to the Riverside County Courthouse with my folder of evidence, my hands shaking as I filled out Form SC-100 at the counter. The clerk stamped it and told me Linda had 30 days to respond to the filing. That evening, Daniel sat at our kitchen table holding the court filing copy, just staring at it without saying anything for 20 minutes. "She's going to make our lives hell," he finally said, but he didn't ask me to withdraw it. 2 days later, while Sophie napped, I installed new deadbolts on all our doors, the drill's noise making my heart race every time I thought about what Linda might do next. Carol from next door waved through the window and gave me a thumbs up. She'd heard about everything from the neighborhood gossip. Day 5 hit like a punch to the gut when my phone buzzed at 6 in the morning with a voicemail from Linda. "You ungrateful witch. I'm calling CPS about how you leave Sophie with strangers. Let's see how you like being investigated." I saved the recording immediately and backed it up to 3 different cloud services. Daniel called his mother that afternoon while I listened on speaker, and she completely denied making any threats about CPS. She kept saying he must have misunderstood her message, that she was just concerned about Sophie's safety with random babysitters. He hung up confused and frustrated, rubbing his temples like he always does when she gaslights him. 3 days later, I spent the entire morning organizing every piece of documentation into a massive binder. Photos of the damage, receipts from the contractor, estimates for repairs, and 2 years' worth of text messages showing her pattern of boundary violations. Each page I added felt like another nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we might have salvaged. Melissa called me on day 10 and agreed to write a statement about being physically removed from our house. She mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Linda had been taking photos of our personal items while she was there. The former babysitter emailed me her statement within an hour, describing exactly how Linda grabbed her bags and pushed her out the door. Day 12 broke my heart when I noticed Sophie flinching during her bedtime routine every time there was a noise outside. My sweet toddler looked up at me with those big eyes and asked, "Grandma scary?" And I had to fight back tears. I just held her tight and told her mommy would keep her safe. But inside, I was burning with rage at what Linda had done to my child's sense of security. 2 days later, at 8 in the evening, there was a knock at the door that made my stomach drop. A woman with a clipboard and official badge stood there saying she was from CPS and needed to inspect our home immediately. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out as I let her in, knowing Linda had actually followed through on her threat. She looked looked through every room, checked Sophie's crib, examined our food supply, and asked about our childcare arrangements. The investigator found nothing concerning, but dropped the bomb that this was just the beginning of a 30-day investigation process. She handed me paperwork explaining that they had to follow up on every report, even anonymous ones, and there would be multiple visits. As she left, I realized Linda knew exactly what she was doing. She was using the system as a weapon against us. The next few days were hell on both of us. Daniel's boss called me on day 12 asking if everything was okay at home because Daniel had missed 3 deadlines and kept leaving meetings to check his phone. His coworkers started avoiding him after he snapped at someone for asking a simple question about a project. I watched him refresh his email every 5 minutes waiting for updates from the CPS worker, while his laptop screen showed the same spreadsheet he'd been staring at for hours. On day 16, I was dragging trash bins to the curb when Carol from next door waved me over to her driveway. She looked around nervously before pulling out her phone and showing me a video from her security camera dated the day Linda broke in. The footage showed Linda trying multiple keys in our front door for 20 minutes before finding one that worked, then coming back out to her car and returning with cleaning supplies, a toolbox, and what looked like paint samples. Carol said she hadn't wanted to get involved, but after seeing the CPS car at our house, she couldn't stay quiet anymore. I hugged her so hard she squeaked. 2 days later, I was eating lunch at my desk when the receptionist called saying I had a visitor in the lobby. Linda stood there in her Sunday best, telling everyone within earshot how she'd just been trying to help her poor, overwhelmed daughter-in-law, who clearly couldn't handle keeping house properly. She raised her voice when she saw me, announcing that this whole misunderstanding could be cleared up if I'd just admit I needed help with basic homemaking skills. My coworkers stared as she followed me toward the elevator, insisting she'd been nothing but generous and supportive. There's something really strange about Linda having multiple keys to try in their door. Where did she even get all those keys from? The way she told that babysitter, "This is my son's house," while kicking her out makes me wonder if she thinks. Security arrived within minutes and had to physically guide her to the exit while she shouted about ungrateful young women who didn't appreciate family help. My supervisor Jennifer called me into her office an hour later, with that look people get when they're about to have an uncomfortable conversation. She asked if I needed time off to handle my personal situation since it was clearly affecting the workplace. I handed her the folder I'd been carrying everywhere with photos of the damage, the police report for trespassing, and screenshots of Linda's harassment, but Jennifer just nodded politely while her eyes said she wished this was someone else's problem. That weekend I took Sophie to the park hoping for some normal toddler time, but noticed other moms pulling their kids away from the sandbox when we arrived. One woman I'd chatted with before suddenly needed to leave when I sat on the bench near her. Another mom whispered something to her friend while looking at us, and I caught the words Facebook and grandmother. Sophie kept asking why nobody wanted to play today, and I had no good answer. Monday's mail brought our credit card statement, and I almost threw up when I saw the charges. Linda had used the emergency card Daniel gave her 3 years ago to rack up $1,800 at Home Depot, Bed Bath & Beyond, and some fancy furniture store downtown. Every single purchase was dated during her break-in day. I took photos of each line item and matched them to the damage in our house. The new curtain rods she'd installed without asking, the throw pillows I'd already thrown in the trash, the area rug that didn't match anything we owned. Daniel came home that night and found me surrounded by receipts and bank statements. He sat on the floor next to me and started crying, really crying. Not the controlled tears I'd seen before, but the ugly sobbing kind that makes your whole body shake. He told me his mom had done the exact same thing to his dad before their divorce when he was 12, breaking into his dad's apartment and redecorating it while accusing him of being an unfit parent. His dad had tried to fight it, but Linda had convinced everyone he was unstable, and Daniel hadn't seen him for 2 years after that. Daniel grabbed my hand and said he thought it would be different with us, that maybe she'd changed, that maybe if he just gave her enough access, she wouldn't go nuclear. 2 days later, I met Melissa at a coffee shop to go over her witness statement for court. She pulled out her phone and showed me something that made my stomach drop. While Linda was in our house that day, she'd gone through our medicine cabinet and taken photos of my anxiety medication and birth control. She'd also photographed personal documents from our filing cabinet, including my therapy records from when my mom died and Daniel's old credit report showing his student loans. Melissa said Linda had been muttering about building a case and proving we were unfit parents. Day 28 brought the biggest shock yet when we got served with legal papers. Linda had filed her own claim in small claims court seeking $5,000 for emotional distress and demanding formal grandparent visitation rights. The paperwork accused us of parental alienation, defamation of character, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She'd hired an actual lawyer while we were still planning to represent ourselves. My hands shook so hard I dropped the papers and Daniel had to pick them up. The audacity of it knocked the wind out of me. 2 days later, the CPS investigator returned for round 2, this time with more forms and more questions. She interviewed us separately, asked Sophie about her daily routine, checked our food supplies, and examined Sophie's room again. She seemed sympathetic when she said multiple reports had been filed and they had to investigate each one thoroughly, but sympathy didn't change the fact that we were still under investigation. That weekend, I spent hours at the public library while Daniel watched Sophie at home. I pulled every California family law book I could find and started reading about grandparent rights. The librarian helped me find the specific statutes, and I took pages of notes. California law was pretty clear that grandparents needed to prove an existing relationship with the child and that the parents were unfit. Linda had neither since we'd limited her contact with Sophie from birth, and we were clearly fit parents. Still, I photocopied everything just in case. Monday morning, my phone rang while I was making breakfast. James Fitzgerald, the contractor who'd assessed the damage to our house, was on the line telling me he'd testify about what he saw. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Linda had called him last week trying to dispute his assessment and offered him $500 to change his statement about the damage costs. He'd recorded the call and was sending me the file. 2 days later, Daniel came home from work looking pale. He'd been going through his email and found messages from his ex-girlfriend Charlotte dating back 3 weeks. His mother had been inviting Charlotte to family dinners and sending her photos of Sophie. The worst part was Linda's message saying Daniel missed what they had together and maybe they should reconnect. I found the whole email chain when Daniel showed me his laptop. Linda had created this whole fantasy about Daniel being unhappy with me. Charlotte had actually responded asking if Daniel knew his mother was doing this. That night, we sat at the kitchen table and I helped Daniel write a cease and desist letter to his mother. His hands shook as he typed each word. We listed every incident, including the property damage, the CPS reports, contact contacting his ex and trying to bribe the contractor. Daniel printed it out and signed it with tears in his eyes. He knew he was drawing a line he couldn't uncross with his mother. We sent it certified mail requiring a signature. 2 days later, the Postal Service confirmed Linda had signed for it. Within an hour, she'd posted on Facebook about being legally threatened by her own son. She wrote this long, dramatic post about how she'd only tried to help, and now her ungrateful son was treating her like a criminal. Daniel's phone started blowing up with calls from relatives. Some sided with us, but others thought we were being too harsh. His cousin called us monsters. His uncle said we were tearing the family apart. Thursday morning, my phone rang while I was at work. Sophie's daycare director sounded stressed as she explained what happened. Linda had shown up claiming to be on the pickup list, and when they said she wasn't authorized, she'd started yelling. She'd grabbed the sign-in clipboard and tried to write her own name on the list. Security had to escort her out, and now the daycare was considering terminating Sophie's enrollment because of the security risk. I left work immediately to pick up Sophie. That evening, Daniel's Aunt Martha called. She'd heard about the cease and desist letter and wanted to warn us. 15 years ago, Linda had done similar things to Daniel's father's new wife after the divorce. She'd filed false reports, shown up at her work, and spread rumors until the marriage fell apart. Martha said Linda wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, which was me out of the picture. She'd seen this pattern before. Saturday morning, I woke up to Sophie screaming in her crib. She was drenched in sweat and crying about Grandma. This was the third nightmare that week. When I tried to comfort her, she kept saying no Grandma over and over. Monday, I took her to the pediatrician who recommended we see a child therapist. Sophie was showing signs of trauma from the stress in our household. 2 days later, the CPS investigator was back at our door for the third time. She looked exhausted as she explained that Linda had now filed 5 separate complaints. Each one had to be investigated even though they all seemed retaliatory. She went through the same routine, checking Sophie's room, our food supplies, and asking more questions. She admitted off the record that this was clearly harassment, but her hands were tied by protocol. Friday afternoon, I was in a meeting when my manager pulled me aside. HR needed to see me immediately. When I got to the HR office, they showed me a formal complaint letter from an attorney. Linda had gotten a family friend who was a lawyer to write that I was creating a hostile work environment by discussing personal matters at work. They'd opened an official investigation, even though my manager said she'd never heard me discuss anything inappropriate. I had to provide a written statement, and they said the investigation could take weeks. I pulled out my phone right there in the HR office and started scrolling through months of texts and emails from Linda. The HR manager's eyes got wider with each screenshot I showed her. There were 43 messages where Linda threatened to show up at my workplace, 16 where she called me unfit to raise Sophie, and one where she straight up said she'd make my life hell until I left Daniel. The HR manager made copies of everything and said they'd need to review this new information, but in the meantime, I should take some paid leave while they investigated, which was exactly what Linda wanted all along. 3 days later, Carol from next door knocked with a folder in her hand. She'd gotten 7 neighbors to sign a letter about what they'd witnessed over the years. Linda screaming in our driveway, the time she tried to break down our door when we wouldn't let her in, the police visits, all of it documented with dates and times. Carol handed me the letter and said, "We all see what's happening and we're here for you." 2 days after that, Melissa called me crying. Linda had been texting her non-stop trying to get her to change her story about what happened that night. She forwarded me screenshots where Linda offered her $2,000 to tell the court I was negligent with Sophie. Linda's playing chess while everyone else thought they were having a nice family dinner. Too bad she learned the rules from a book called How to Lose Everything in 30 Moves. Melissa said she'd already sent everything to my lawyer and would testify about the bribe attempt. The next morning, Daniel's phone rang while he was in the shower, so I answered it. His boss wanted him to come in immediately. When Daniel got to his office, they told him his mother had called claiming I was mentally unstable and he needed time off to handle our family crisis. His boss suggested he take unpaid leave to sort things out. Daniel came home pale and shaking. That night, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Linda left 12 voicemails in 1 hour demanding he call her back, each one more frantic than the last. Daniel sat in his car in our driveway listening to them, and when he came back inside, his eyes were red. He blocked her number right there in front of me and said he was done, that the mother he wanted to have never existed. I made an appointment with a family law attorney who specialized in harassment cases. She looked through everything I'd documented and immediately identified it as litigation abuse. She said Linda was using the legal system to harass us and agreed to write a formal complaint to the lawyer friend who'd been helping Linda. That weekend, while I was organizing all our evidence into labeled folders, I noticed something. Every single time Linda had escalated, it was right after Daniel had set a boundary with her. When he told her she couldn't have a key to our apartment, she called our landlord claiming we were dealing drugs. When he said she couldn't be in the delivery room, she announced my pregnancy on Facebook. When he chose to spend Christmas with my family instead of hers, she showed up at my parents' house uninvited. The pattern was so clear once I saw it. 2 days later, Linda's lawyer friend called to say he was withdrawing from representing her after receiving the ethics complaint from my attorney. He said he hadn't known the full story and wanted nothing more to do with the case. Within 3 hours, Daniel's phone had 37 texts from Linda. Even though she was blocked, she'd started using different numbers. The messages ranged from calling him ungrateful, to threatening to disown him, to begging him to make this all go away. I took Sophie's enrollment paperwork to the daycare director, along with a copy of our restraining order application and the security plan we'd put in place. They agreed to keep her enrolled with extra precautions like requiring photo ID for pickup and calling us immediately if Linda showed up. Sophie had been having nightmares, but after a few days without surprise grandma visits, she started sleeping through the night again. Finally, the call came from CPS. After a 2-month investigation, they were closing the case as unfounded. The caseworker said they'd documented everything and warned me that repeated false reports like Linda's were actually a form of harassment I could use in court. She gave me a case number and said to call if Linda tried it again. 3 days later, I was searching online for anything that might help our case when I found something that made my stomach drop. Linda had been sued before, twice. The county records showed everything. In 2018, her neighbor sued her for breaking into their yard and destroying their garden shed during what Linda called a property line dispute. The case settled for $4,000. Then in 2020, her own sister took her to court after Linda damaged her kitchen during an uninvited visit to help with renovations. That one settled for $6,000. I printed everything and added it to my growing pile of evidence. Daniel came home that night looking shaken. He'd called his dad for the first time in 5 years. They'd talked for 3 hours. His dad sent over boxes of old court documents from the divorce showing Linda's pattern of false false accusations and harassment. The papers showed she'd accused his dad of theft, abuse, even drug dealing, all proven false in court. His dad's final email said she never changes and never will. 2 days later, I went back to work after HR finally cleared me from Linda's false report. Nobody said anything directly, but I could feel the difference. People stopped talking when I walked by. I ate lunch alone at my desk and spent the time organizing court documents instead of joining the break room conversations. The court notice arrived that Friday. Judge Patricia Winters would hear our case. I looked her up immediately. She had a reputation for being tough on people who filed false claims and wasted the court's time. For the first time in weeks, I felt actual hope. Saturday was Sophie's second birthday party at the park. We'd picked a public space specifically because the restraining order didn't cover public areas. Halfway through the party, Linda showed up. She walked in carrying a huge wrapped present and a designer gift bag, smiling like nothing had happened. The other parents looked confused as she gushed about her beautiful granddaughter. She stayed right at the edge of the party area, technically not violating any orders. I didn't say a word to her, but I took out my phone and recorded everything. Every fake smile, every attempt to get close to Sophie, every confused look from other parents. Later, 3 different moms pulled me aside to say Linda's behavior made them uncomfortable, especially how she kept trying to get Sophie alone for photos. I wrote down their names and numbers. Monday morning, Sophie's therapist called with an update. She'd written a detailed letter documenting Sophie's new anxiety symptoms that started right after the home invasion. Night terrors, separation anxiety, fear of strangers in the house, professional documentation of the harm Linda caused. That same day, Daniel's dad called back. He was flying in from Arizona to testify. He had 20 years of documentation about Linda's behavior, including police reports, court orders, and witness statements from their divorce. He said it was time someone finally stopped her. 2 days later, James called me furious. Linda had filed a complaint with the California Department of Consumer Affairs against his contractor license. She claimed his damage assessment was fraudulent, and he was helping us commit insurance fraud. The complaint could affect his whole business. He said he'd never been more motivated to testify against someone in his entire career. By the end of the week, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by evidence. 3 binders full. Over 100 documented instances of harassment, property damage, false reports, and witness statements. Photos, videos, receipts, official documents. 3 months of my life spent building an airtight case. My lawyer called the next morning and said she'd reviewed everything and wanted to file a countersuit for emotional distress on top of the property damage. She came over that afternoon with the paperwork already drafted and walked me through each page while Sophie played with blocks on the floor. The new total came to $8,500 when she added up all the harassment and false reports Linda had made over the years. 2 days later, Daniel and I sat at the dining table going over what we'd say in court. He kept stopping mid-sentence and rubbing his face with both hands whenever he had to describe what his mom had done. I watched him practice saying the words about the damage to our house, and each time his voice got a little steadier, but his eyes looked more tired. That Friday, a package arrived with no return address, and inside was a thick envelope addressed to every single person in Daniel's family. Linda had put together what she called evidence that I was an unfit mother, including photos she'd edited to make it look like our house was filthy, and text messages taken completely out of context where I'd joked with friends about needing wine after a long day with Sophie. My phone started ringing within an hour with confused relatives asking Daniel what was going on. His cousin Martha called first, and after Daniel explained everything, she said she was disgusted by Linda's behavior. By Sunday, Martha had convinced 2 other relatives to write character statements for me after they saw through Linda's desperate attempts to make me look bad. The lawyer filed everything with the court on Monday and called to tell me our hearing was set for exactly 20 days out. I wrote the date on our calendar in red ink and felt my stomach drop knowing we had less than 3 weeks to prepare. Tuesday morning, Daniel discovered $5,000 missing from an old savings account he'd forgotten his mother still had access to from when he was in college. The bank statement showed she'd written in the memo line that it was for legal fees to see her granddaughter. We drove straight to the bank, but the manager said it was a civil matter since she was technically still on the account. I went to the police station that afternoon to file a report about the theft, even though they also said it was civil. The officer took my statement and gave me a case number which my lawyer said would help show a pattern of financial abuse in court. Daniel spent the next 2 days closing every single account his mother might have access to and removing her as an emergency contact from his work, his doctor, even his gym membership. He sat at the computer for hours changing passwords and security questions, and each click seemed to make his shoulders sag a little more. Thursday brought good news when James the contractor called to say the board had thrown out Linda's complaint against him as completely baseless. He emailed me the official dismissal letter for our court case and mentioned Linda now owed him $500 for the legal fees he'd had to pay to respond to her false complaint. By Saturday, Linda had found a grandparents' rights Facebook group and posted a long sob story about being kept from her granddaughter by her evil daughter-in-law. Within hours, I started getting friend requests and messages from strangers calling me horrible names and saying I was destroying a family. Linda's playing multiple phone numbers like she's running some underground operation just to text Daniel. The timing of finding those old lawsuits right when they need evidence feels awfully convenient. Daniel spent the entire weekend reporting each account and taking screenshots of every single message for our growing pile of evidence. Monday morning, my boss called me into her office and I brought the whole stack of screenshots and evidence with me just in case. She looked through everything while shaking her head and told me to take whatever time I needed for court. 2 days later, the daycare called to tell me Linda had tried to get Sophie's records by claiming she was checking for neglect. Their lawyer shut it down fast since attendance records had nothing to do with property damage. The desperation was getting worse. 4 days before court, I woke up at 2 in the morning to someone pounding on our front door so hard the whole frame was shaking. Linda was outside screaming about her rights as a grandmother while banging on every window she could reach. The neighbors called the cops before we could even get downstairs. The officer who showed up took one look at her wild eyes and shaking hands and wrote in his report that she seemed unstable and fixated on us. We added that report to our evidence pile the next morning. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours writing page after page to his mother. He poured out everything he'd never said about how she'd hurt him and controlled him and made him feel small. When he finished, he took all 12 pages out to the backyard fire pit and burned them while I held his hand. The next day was nothing but preparation. I spread everything across the dining room table and organized it into 3 fat binders. Property damage photos in the first one, harassment documentation in the second, witness statements and professional assessments in the third. Sophie played with her blocks on the floor while we worked and kept looking up at me asking if Mama was okay. Her little worried face made me more determined than ever. That evening while we were eating dinner, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Linda. Her voice was pure venom as she promised to destroy me in court tomorrow. She said no judge would ever side with a vindictive daughter-in-law over a loving grandmother. I saved it as Exhibit 47. Court morning came fast. We got to the Riverside Courthouse at 8:30 with James the contractor, Melissa, Carol from next door, and even Daniel's dad who'd driven 3 hours to be there. Martha from down the street showed up too with her own folder of documentation. Linda arrived alone 15 minutes later, wearing a black dress like she was going to a funeral. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Daniel walked over to his mother one last time. He looked her right in the eyes and said it didn't have to be this way. She spat at his feet. The bailiff saw the whole thing and wrote it down in his notebook. The courtroom doors opened and we all filed in, taking our seats on opposite sides while Judge Patricia Winters settled behind the bench with a stack of papers. She was maybe 60 with gray hair pulled back tight and glasses that made her eyes look bigger than they were. She looked at both of us, then down at the paperwork, then back up again. Mrs. Gomez, you're seeking $3,027 in property damage plus $5,473 in harassment damages, and Ms. A. Linda Gomez, you're countersuing for $5,000. So let's begin. I stood up with my folder of evidence and walked to the small table in front, spreading out the photos of my destroyed kitchen, the cracked countertop, the gouged floors, everything dated and labeled. Patricia leaned forward to examine each photo while I explained the timeline, how I'd been away for the weekend, how Linda had used her spare key without permission, how she'd fired my babysitter and caused all this damage. Linda kept making these huffing sounds from her table, shaking her head and muttering loud enough for everyone to hear. When I showed the contractor's estimate, Linda stood up and said the photos were fake, that I'd edited them on my computer, that the damage was already there before she ever stepped foot in the house. Patricia looked at her over her glasses and told her she'd have her turn to speak, but right now she needed to sit down and be quiet. Linda sat but kept muttering about lies and conspiracies. James came up next with his professional assessment folder, explaining each repair cost in detail and how the damage patterns showed recent impact, not wear and tear. He mentioned how Linda had called him after getting the estimate, offering him $2,000 to say the damage was pre-existing. Patricia's eyebrows went up at that and she made a note. James also told her about Linda filing a complaint with the contractor's board trying to get his license revoked, which was dismissed as baseless. Melissa took the stand next, still looking nervous but determined. She described how Linda had barged in that Saturday morning, grabbed her arm, and physically pushed her toward the door while telling her she was fired. Melissa said Linda had gone through the medicine cabinet taking photos of prescription bottles and had been photographing personal documents on the kitchen counter. Linda jumped up and screamed, "Liar!" so loud that everyone in the courtroom jumped. Patricia slammed her gavel and told Linda if she had one more outburst, she'd be held in contempt. Daniel went up next, and I could see his hands shaking as he gripped the podium. His voice cracked as he described years of his mother's behavior, how she'd driven away friends, ruined holidays, made our lives miserable with her constant interference and control. He talked about finding out she'd been telling his coworkers I was cheating on him, how she'd tried to convince him to get a paternity test for Sophie, how she'd threatened to call CPS if we didn't let her move in with us. Linda stared at him with such hatred that even Patricia noticed and told her to face forward. Then Daniel's father walked in, which made Linda go white as a sheet. He hadn't been on our witness list, but Patricia allowed him after he explained he'd driven 3 hours when he heard about the case. He brought divorce papers from 20 years ago showing Linda's false accusations against him, police reports from when she'd vandalized his car, restraining orders she'd violated. He described the same pattern of escalation, the same threats, the same attempts to alienate him from family and friends. Patricia's expression got more and more serious as she read through the documents. Carol came up with her laptop and showed the security footage from her doorbell camera that had a clear angle of our driveway. The timestamp showed Linda arriving at 9:15 that Saturday morning while I was already 2 hours away, using her key to enter while the babysitter's car was clearly visible in the driveway. The footage from Sunday showed Linda leaving at 4 in the afternoon, just 3 hours before I got home. Patricia called a 15-minute recess and we all filed out into the hallway. I went to the bathroom and when I came back, Daniel was pale and pointing down the hall where Linda had cornered Martha against the wall, her finger in Martha's face, hissing something about keeping her mouth shut or she'd regret it. The bailiff saw it too and immediately stepped between them, writing it all down and telling Patricia when we went back in. Linda decided to represent herself for her countersuit, standing up and launching into this wild speech about grandparent rights, how I was abusing Sophie by feeding her processed foods, how I was alienating her from her only grandchild, how Daniel was under my spell and couldn't see what I was doing to their family. Patricia asked if she had any evidence for these claims. Linda said the evidence was obvious to anyone with eyes. Patricia asked for documents, photos, witnesses, anything concrete. Linda said she didn't need evidence because a grandmother knows when her grandchild is in danger. Patricia asked if she had any proof of the $5,000 in damages she was claiming. Linda said the damage was emotional and spiritual and couldn't be measured in dollars, but $5,000 was the minimum for what she'd suffered. Patricia shifted her papers and looked directly at Linda, asking if she had entered my house on the date in question. Linda straightened in her chair and said she had every right to check on her granddaughter when her son was away. She called it improving the house, not damaging it. And when Patricia asked about the $5,000 withdrawal from Daniel's savings account, Linda's face went red. She claimed it was payment for years of free babysitting, as if that justified theft. Patricia wrote something down while I pulled out my folder of evidence. I handed over the letter from Sophie's therapist describing nightmares and anxiety after the incident, the official CPS report closing Linda's complaint as unfounded, and the HR investigation documents clearing me of her workplace harassment claims. The stack of papers made a solid thud on Patricia's desk. Patricia studied each document carefully, then turned to Linda and asked the simple question we'd all been waiting for. Did she break into her son's home? Linda's answer made everyone in the room freeze. It's not breaking in if you're family, she said, like that made perfect sense. Patricia's eyebrows went up so high they almost disappeared into her hairline. Daniel stood up then, his hands shaking as he spoke to the judge. He loved his mother but loved his family more, and his wife and daughter deserved peace and safety. Linda started crying loudly, the kind of fake sobbing she always did when things weren't going her way. Patricia raised her hand for silence and delivered her verdict in a clear, firm voice. She found for us, the plaintiffs, ordering Linda to to pay the original $3,027 in property damage plus an additional $5,473 in emotional distress damages. Patricia's asking for evidence and Linda's offering spiritual damage calculations. That's like bringing feelings to a fact fight. Someone clearly missed the memo about how courts work with actual proof instead of grandmother's intuition. The countersuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Linda could never file it again. Linda jumped up screaming that she would appeal, that this wasn't over, that we'd destroyed her life. Patricia's voice cut through the noise like a knife, warning that any further harassment would result in criminal charges, and this was Linda's only warning. Linda stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. In the parking lot, something unexpected happened that made me stop in my tracks. Daniel's father, who hadn't spoken to his son in 2 years because of Linda's lies, walked over and pulled Daniel into a tight hug. He said he was proud of Daniel for standing up for his family, for doing the right thing even though it was hard. Daniel broke down completely, sobbing into his father's shoulder like a little boy who'd finally gotten the approval he'd been waiting for his whole life. A week later, the check arrived by certified mail, exactly $8,500 drawn from Linda's retirement account. No note, no apology, just the legal minimum required by the court order. I drove straight to the bank and deposited it before she could try to stop payment. Daniel started seeing a therapist the following week, sitting in that office every Tuesday trying to work through decades of his mother's manipulation and control. He told me he needed to break this cycle before Sophie got older, before our daughter learned that love meant accepting abuse. 2 weeks after the court date, Martha called with news that made my stomach twist in a strange way. Linda had packed up and moved 2 hours away to live with her sister, telling everyone in their small town that she'd been legally robbed by her ungrateful son and his evil wife. Martha said Linda was playing the victim to anyone who would listen, but wasn't taking any actual legal action, probably because her lawyer had told her she'd lose again. 3 weeks passed, and Sophie's nightmares finally stopped happening. The therapist showed me a drawing Sophie made during their session, just 3 stick figures holding hands with a sun above them, no fourth person anywhere on the page. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The next week, I took all those spare keys Linda had made and locked them in our bank's safety deposit box, then spent the afternoon changing every security code in the house from the alarm system to the garage door opener. Daniel helped me reset the smart doorbell, and we deleted Linda's face from the recognition system. Everything felt different now, like we could finally breathe in our own home without waiting for her to burst through the door. 2 months after court, Daniel found a thick envelope in our mailbox with his sister's return address, but Linda's handwriting visible through the window. He stood there in the driveway for maybe 30 seconds, then walked straight to the recycling bin and tossed it in without opening it. That weekend, he cleaned out the garage and found boxes of his old stuff from childhood that Linda had been storing there, things she'd insisted we keep for sentimental value. He loaded everything into his truck and donated it all to Goodwill. 3 months after the court date, Daniel's dad came to our family BBQ alone. Half the relatives who usually showed up didn't come, the ones who'd taken Linda's side, but the people who did come actually seemed happy to be there. Daniel's dad played with Sophie in the backyard while I grilled burgers, and nobody mentioned Linda's name even once. The whole afternoon felt normal in a way our gatherings never had before. Daniel and I started seeing a couples counselor that same month. We sat on her couch every Tuesday talking about boundaries and communication and all the ways Linda's behavior had messed with our heads over the years. Daniel talked about growing up with her constant criticism and control, stuff he'd never told me before. The counselor gave us homework assignments about checking in with each other and making decisions together without considering what Linda might think. 4 months after court, Carol stopped me while I was getting the mail. She mentioned she hadn't seen Linda's car on our street since that day in court and said the whole neighborhood felt more relaxed without her random visits. The other neighbors had apparently been talking about it too, how they didn't miss seeing her march up to our door with her spare key. Sophie started preschool that same week without any drama at all. No surprise visits from grandma at pickup time, no one trying to sign her out early, no weird gifts left with the office staff. Her teacher said Sophie was doing great, making friends and participating in all the activities without any signs of anxiety. Daniel spent a whole Saturday going through old photo albums from his childhood. He pulled out every picture where you could see the strain in his fake smile or Linda hovering possessively behind him. He threw most of them away but kept one single photo of himself as a baby before she'd started trying to control everything. That night I sat at the kitchen table writing in my journal while Daniel gave Sophie a bath upstairs. I wrote about how the house repairs were done. The money was back in our account, but the real win was the quiet. Sophie played without looking over her shoulder. Daniel laughed at dumb TV shows without tensing up at every car door slam, and I could leave the house without wondering what I'd find when I got back. Sunday morning came 4 months after everything went down. I stood at the stove making pancakes while Daniel sat on the living room floor building blocks with Sophie. The furniture arranged exactly how we wanted it. Through the kitchen window, I saw Carol watering her garden, and she waved at me with a genuine smile. Sophie's giggles filled the house as Daniel made silly voices for her stuffed animals. The coffee maker gurgled, cartoons played softly on the TV, and nobody knocked on our door or tried their key in our lock. I flipped another pancake and realized this boring, normal Sunday morning was exactly what winning looked like. Not some big dramatic moment or final confrontation, just our little family eating breakfast in peace without looking over our shoulders or jumping at unexpected sounds. Just us, finally just us, in our own home living our own life. Thanks for letting me wonder about all these interesting moments with you. It's been quite the journey together. See you around. Like the video. It helps more than you think.